step away from the vehicle. Doing what? Cleaning? A judge? Right. And I'm the Pope.
A black man in a torn suit, knees scraped and bloodied, hands cuffed behind his back so tight the metal bites into his wrists. And surrounding him, two police officers, laughing, not just chuckling, full-throated laughter, the kind that echoes off concrete walls and burrows into your chest, the kind that says, "You're nothing." Around them, a crowd gathers, phones raised, recording, flashing, witnesses to humiliation in real time. But here's the thing about humiliation. Sometimes it's temporary. Because what those officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known in that moment of cruel certainty, was that the man they were mocking, the man they dragged through the dirt, wasn't just anyone. He was the judge. And in less than 2 hours, they'd be standing in his courtroom. This is that story. Let's rewind. 6:47 a.m. A Tuesday morning in late September. The kind of morning where the air still holds a bite of coolness, but you know the sun's going to burn it away by noon. The city of Brennan Falls was waking up. Coffee shops opening, commuters flooding the streets. And in a modest townhouse on the east side, a man named Elijah Thorne was running late. Not terribly late, just late enough to feel it. Elijah stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. Navy blue silk, perfectly pressed white shirt. The charcoal suit jacket hanging on the door behind him was tailored, elegant, the kind of clothing that commanded respect the moment you walked into a room. But Elijah wasn't thinking about respect right now. He was thinking about the calendar on his phone, the one that said, 9 a.m., State versus Brennan PD, Courtroom 5A. A high-profile case. Excessive force allegations. Internal corruption. The kind of case that could shake a department to its core. And Elijah Thorne, Judge Elijah Thorne, was presiding. He grabbed his briefcase, checked his watch, and headed out the door. 7:04 a.m. He had time. But time, as it turns out, has a cruel sense of humor. Elijah's car, a sensible, 8-year-old sedan that he refused to replace because it still runs fine, had other plans. He was 3 miles from the courthouse when it happened. A sputter, a cough, and then nothing. The engine died. Elijah coasted to the shoulder of Parkway Avenue, a stretch of road that ran along the industrial side of town. Warehouses, chain-link fences, cracked pavement. Not exactly the kind of neighborhood where a man in a $3,000 suit blends in. He popped the hood, checked his phone. No signal. Of course. He could have called a cab if he had service. Could have walked to the courthouse if it wasn't 5 miles away. But Elijah wasn't the type to panic. Not yet. He rolled up his sleeves and bent over the engine, trying to figure out what was wrong. That's when he heard it. The slow roll of tires on gravel. A police cruiser. Officer Leon Briggs was 32 years old, 7 years on the force, and in his own mind, he'd seen it all. He spotted the sedan on the shoulder. Saw a man bent over the engine. Black male. Suit. Alone. Briggs exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Vincent Shaw, a stockier man with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl. "Check it out," Shaw asked. "Might as well," Briggs replied. The cruiser pulled up behind Elijah's car. Lights on. No sirens. Just presence. Elijah straightened, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. He turned toward the approaching officers, and for just a moment, relief flickered across his face. "Help." "Morning, officers," Elijah said, his voice calm, polite. "Car broke down. I was just trying to." "Step away from the vehicle," Briggs interrupted. Elijah blinked. "Excuse me." "Step away from the vehicle." There was no warmth in Briggs' voice. No courtesy. Just command. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he complied. He stepped back, hands visible, open palms facing forward. "Is there a problem, officer?" Shaw circled around the car, eyes scanning the interior through the windows. Briggs stepped closer to Elijah, his hand resting casually on his belt. Too casually. "This your car?" Briggs asked. "Yes." "Registration and ID." Elijah reached slowly into his jacket pocket. Slowly. Deliberately. The way you move when you know a wrong gesture could be misinterpreted. He handed over his license and registration. Briggs barely glanced at them. "Elijah Thorne," Briggs read aloud, his tone flat. "What are you doing out here, Elijah?" "Like I said, my car broke down. I'm actually late for." "For what?" "Work." "Where do you work?" Elijah hesitated. Not because he was hiding anything, but because he could feel it. The shift. The way Briggs was looking at him. The way Shaw was circling like a predator. "I work at the county courthouse," Elijah said carefully. Briggs smirked. "Doing what?" "Cleaning." The words landed like a slap. Shaw laughed. Not loud. Just enough. Elijah's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice stayed even. "I'm a judge." Silence. And then Briggs laughed. Harder this time. "A judge," he repeated, shaking his head. "Right. And I'm the Pope." Shaw walked back over, shaking his head. "Nothing in the car." "Clean. Clean," Briggs said, raising an eyebrow. "We'll see about that." Elijah's pulse quickened. "Wait. What are you?" "Sir, I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back." "For what?" "Suspicious behavior. Failure to comply." "I've complied with everything you've." "Hands. Behind. Your back." Elijah's mind raced. He could argue. He could escalate. But he'd seen too many cases. Read too many files. Knew how these things ended when a black man argued with police on an empty roadside. So he did what logic demanded. Even as rage simmered beneath his skin, he turned around, placed his hands behind his back. The cuffs clicked into place. Tight. Too tight. "This is a mistake," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "I'm telling you, I'm a judge. I'm expected in court in less than 2 hours." "Sure you are," Shaw muttered. Briggs leaned in close, his breath hot against Elijah's ear. "You know what I think? I think you stole this car. I think you're out here scoping for another one. And I think you're about to have a very bad day." Elijah didn't respond. He couldn't. Because in that moment, he realized something. They weren't going to listen. The cruiser pulled into a nearby parking lot, an old strip mall with a convenience store, a laundromat, and a handful of people milling about. Briggs yanked Elijah out of the back seat, rougher than necessary. Elijah stumbled, his knees hitting the pavement. Pain shot up his legs. His suit tore at the knee. "Get up," Briggs barked. Elijah struggled to his feet, wrists still cuffed, blood seeping through the fabric of his pants. And that's when the phones came out. A woman outside the laundromat. A teenager near the store. An older man in a truck. All of them recording. "Yo, what did he do?" someone called out. "Nothing," Elijah said, his voice carrying. "I did nothing." "Shut up," Shaw snapped. But the crowd was growing. Murmurs. Whispers. "That's messed up, man. He's bleeding." They didn't even tell him why. Briggs felt it. The shift. The eyes. The judgment. "Everyone back up," he shouted. "This is police business." But no one moved. And Elijah, standing there with torn clothes and bloodied knees, met the eyes of the crowd. He didn't look away. Inside the courthouse, 5 miles away, chaos was beginning to brew. 8:43 a.m. Judge Thorne's clerk, a sharp woman named Naomi Ruiz, stood outside courtroom 5A with her phone pressed to her ear. No answer. She'd called Elijah 3 times. Texted twice. Nothing. The courtroom was packed. Attorneys. Defendants. Press. And in the front row, 3 officers from the Brennan Falls Police Department, dressed in full uniform, waiting to testify. Naomi walked over to the bailiff, a grizzled man named Hugh Trammell. "Hugh, have you heard from Judge Thorne?" "Not a word. He's never late. First time for everything." But Naomi's instincts were screaming. Something was wrong. She dialed again. Still nothing. Elijah sat in a holding cell at the Brennan Falls police station. His suit was ruined. His wrists were raw. His knees throbbed. But his mind? Crystal clear. He'd asked for his phone call. Been denied. He'd stated his name, his title, his position. Been ignored. And now, he sat in silence, watching the clock on the wall tick closer to 9 a.m. Outside the cell, Briggs and Shaw were filling out paperwork, laughing about something. The sound drifted down the hall. Elijah closed his eyes. He thought about the courtroom waiting for him. The case. The officers who were supposed to testify. And then he thought about Briggs and Shaw. And he smiled. Not a happy smile. A knowing one. Because in 47 minutes, the truth would walk through that courtroom door. And it would be wearing a judge's robe. 8:57 a.m. Naomi Ruiz made a decision. She walked into courtroom 5A and approached the bench. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "we're going to delay the start of today's proceedings. Judge Thorne has been unavoidably detained. We'll reconvene at 10 a.m. Groans. Confusion. Whispers. One of the defense attorneys stood. "Detained? What does that mean?" "It means," Naomi said carefully, "that Judge Thorne will be here. Soon." In the front row, One of the officers, a sergeant named Todd Ames, leaned over to his colleague. Think he's dodging this? Ames muttered. Wouldn't blame him, the other replied. They had no idea. 9:14 a.m. A sergeant at the station, an older man named Gary Holt, was reviewing the morning's intake forms when something caught his eye. Name, Elijah Thorne. Occupation, listed as judge. Holt frowned. He walked down the hall to the holding area. Briggs, he called. Get over here. Briggs looked up, annoyed. What? This guy you brought in. Elijah Thorne. You run him? Yeah, clean record. Some kind of clerical worker or something. Did you look him up? Like, actually look him up? Briggs' face went blank. Holt pulled out his phone, typed quickly, and then his face went pale. Oh my God. What? Holt turned the phone around. On the screen was a photo from the county courthouse website. The Honorable Judge Elijah Thorne. Same face. Same man. Currently sitting in their holding cell. Briggs felt his stomach drop. Shaw walked over. What's going on? Holt's voice was barely a whisper. You two just arrested a judge. And that's where we pause. Because in a few minutes, someone's going to have to walk down to that cell, unlock those cuffs, and try to explain. But here's the real question. When Judge Elijah Thorne walks into that courtroom, with torn clothes, bloodied knees, and raw wrists, what's he going to do? Will he show mercy? Or will justice finally have its day? Find out in part 2. Because this story, it's just getting started. Shaw walked over. What's going on? Holt's voice was barely a whisper. You two just arrested a judge. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Briggs' face went from confusion to disbelief to pure, unfiltered dread in the span of 3 seconds. What? Holt thrust the phone forward. The courthouse website. The photo. The title. The Honorable Judge Elijah Thorne. Superior Court. Criminal Division. Shaw leaned in, squinting at the screen. His face drained of color. That's not. That's him, Holt said, his voice tight. That's the guy sitting in our holding cell right now. The one you cuffed. The one you dragged across pavement. The one you laughed at. Briggs felt his knees go weak. His mind raced through the morning. Every word. Every smirk. Every moment of cruel certainty. You steal this car? What are you doing? Cleaning. You're about to have a very bad day. Oh God. Shaw's hands were shaking. We didn't know. He didn't show us a badge or... He told you. Holt hissed. He told you he was a judge. You didn't believe him. And now, he checked his watch. Now he's supposed to be in a courtroom in 40 minutes presiding over a case against our department. The silence that followed was deafening. Briggs felt bile rise in his throat. What do we do? Shaw whispered. Holt's jaw clenched. You go down there. You uncuff him. You apologize. And you pray he doesn't bury this entire department. Briggs and Shaw walked down the narrow corridor toward the holding cells like men walking to their own execution. Each step echoed. Each breath felt heavier than the last. They reached the cell. Elijah sat on the metal bench, back straight, hands still cuffed behind him. His torn suit. His bloodied knees. His raw wrists. But his eyes? Clear. Steady. Unbroken. He looked up at them and said nothing. Briggs fumbled with the keys. His hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the cell door. Your Honor, Briggs began, his voice cracking. There's been a mistake, Elijah said quietly. Briggs nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Elijah stood slowly, turned around, presented his wrists. Shaw stepped forward with the key to the cuffs. His hands trembled as he unlocked them. The metal clicked open. Elijah brought his hands forward, rubbing his raw wrists. Red marks. Deep indentations. The kind that would bruise for days. He looked at Briggs. Then at Shaw. Still said nothing. Your Honor, Shaw tried, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't know. You have to understand, we thought. You thought what? Elijah's voice was soft. Dangerously soft. That a black man in a suit on the side of the road must be a criminal? That when I told you I was a judge, I was lying? That I deserved to be humiliated? Bled? Laughed at? Briggs opened his mouth. Closed it. No words came. I need my phone, Elijah said. And my belongings. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. They scrambled. Within minutes, Elijah had his phone, his wallet, his briefcase. Everything they'd taken. He checked the time. 9:31 a.m. He had 29 minutes to get to the courthouse. I'll need a ride, Elijah said. Of course, Holt said, appearing in the doorway. I'll drive you myself, Your Honor. And, I'm sorry. Truly. Elijah looked at him. Holt wasn't one of the arresting officers. He was trying to clean up their mess. "Let's go," Elijah said. The drive to the courthouse was silent. Holt kept glancing at Elijah in the rearview mirror, wanting to say something. Anything. "But what do you say?" Elijah stared out the window, his jaw tight. His mind wasn't on the apology he'd never received. It wasn't even on Briggs and Shaw. It was on every black man who'd been in his position. Every man who didn't have a title to save him. Every man who couldn't say, "I'm a judge," and have it matter. Because the truth was, it shouldn't have mattered. He should have been treated with dignity because he was human, not because he wore a robe. The car pulled up to the courthouse steps. 9:54 a.m. Elijah stepped out. His torn suit. His bloodied knees. His bruised wrists. And he walked inside. The courthouse lobby fell silent as Elijah walked through. Lawyers stopped mid-conversation. Court staff stared. Security guards straightened. Because Judge Elijah Thorne, always immaculate, always composed, looked like he'd been to war. Naomi Ruiz was pacing near the elevator when she saw him. Her eyes went wide. "Elijah." She rushed over. "Oh my God, what happened?" "I'll explain later," Elijah said quietly. "Is the courtroom ready?" "Yes, but you can't. You need medical attention. You need." "I need to do my job, Naomi." His voice left no room for argument. She swallowed hard. Nodded. "Courtroom 5A. Everyone's waiting." Elijah stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. And for just a moment, alone in that small metal box, he let himself breathe. He closed his eyes, felt the sting in his knees, the ache in his wrists, and then he opened his eyes, straightened his torn jacket, and prepared to walk into that courtroom. 10:02 a.m. Courtroom 5A was packed. Attorneys shuffled papers. The gallery buzzed with whispers. And in the front row, the three officers from Brennan Falls PD sat in their crisp uniforms, waiting to testify in the excessive force case. Sergeant Todd Ames leaned back, arms crossed. He'd been on the force 19 years. He'd testified dozens of times. This was routine. The bailiff, Hugh Trammell, stood near the judge's bench, glancing at the door. And then it opened. Judge Elijah Thorne walked in. The room went silent. Not the respectful silence of a judge entering. The stunned, disbelieving silence of people seeing something impossible. His suit was torn at the knee. Blood had dried on the fabric. His wrists bore the red marks of handcuffs. His face was composed, but his eyes told a story. "All rise," Hugh said, his voice catching. The Honorable Judge Elijah Thorne presiding. Everyone stood, but no one could look away from his appearance. Elijah walked to the bench slowly, deliberately. He set down his briefcase, adjusted his robe, the one Naomi had brought to his chambers, and sat. "You may be seated," he said. The room sat as one. Elijah looked out at the faces before him. The attorneys, the defendants, the officers. And then he spoke. "Before we begin today's proceedings, I need to address what I'm sure you've all noticed." Silence. This morning, at approximately 7:15 a.m., my car broke down on Parkway Avenue. I was approached by two officers from the Brennan Falls Police Department. I complied with every request. I identified myself. I provided my credentials. And despite all of that, I was arrested. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I was handcuffed. I was thrown to the ground. I was mocked. And when I told those officers I was a judge, they laughed in my face. The three officers in the front row looked at each other, confusion and horror dawning on their faces. This wasn't about them, but it was about their department. "I share this," Elijah continued, "not for sympathy, not for attention, but because what happened to me this morning happens to black men in this country every single day. And most of them don't have a title to hide behind. Most of them don't get an apology. Most of them don't get their day in court." His voice was steady, strong. "I am a judge. I have power in this room. But this morning, on that roadside, I was just another black man in handcuffs. And that should terrify all of us." The room was frozen. So as we proceed with today's case, a case about excessive force, about abuse of power, about the trust between police and community, I want you to remember something. He paused. Justice isn't just a word we carve into stone. It's a promise we make to every person who walks through these doors. And when we break that promise, when we allow power to corrupt, when we let prejudice guide our hands, we don't just fail one person. We fail everyone. Elijah looked directly at the officers in the front row. "Today, we will examine the evidence. We will hear testimony. and we will determine whether the actions of certain officers meet the standard of justice this community deserves. He picked up his gavel. And I will preside over this case with the same integrity I expect from every officer who wears a badge. He struck the gavel once. The sound echoed through the courtroom like thunder. We will now hear opening statements. The case unfolded over the next 3 hours. Evidence was presented. Witnesses testified. Body camera footage was played. And through it all, Judge Elijah Thorne sat on that bench with torn knees and bruised wrists, a living testament to the very injustice being examined. The defense attorneys tried to argue procedure, tried to argue context, but every time they spoke, the courtroom's eyes drifted to the judge's wrists. The red marks. The proof. When the plaintiff's attorney, a fierce woman named Simone Torres, stood to give her closing statement, she didn't mince words. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. But today, something else speaks even louder. The fact that a judge, an officer of this court, a man of impeccable record, could be treated the way he was this morning tells us everything we need to know about the culture within the Brennan Falls Police Department. She turned to the jury. If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. 3 weeks later, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Excessive force. Violation of civil rights. Departmental negligence. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Some wept. And Judge Elijah Thorne sat quietly, gavel in hand. He struck it once. Order returned. The court thanks the jury for their service, he said. Sentencing will be scheduled for next month. As the room cleared, Naomi approached the bench. You okay? She asked softly. Elijah looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. I am now. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Officer Leon Briggs resigned from the force. So did Vincent Shaw. Sergeant Gary Holt initiated a department-wide review of arrest procedures and bias training. And Judge Elijah Thorne? He continued to preside, continued to serve. But something had shifted. He started speaking at community forums, visiting schools, talking to young black men about their rights, about justice, about dignity. Because he realized something that morning on Parkway Avenue. His title hadn't protected him, but maybe his story could protect someone else. Months later, a reporter asked him about that day. Your Honor, do you regret not identifying yourself more forcefully? Not demanding they check your credentials? Elijah thought for a moment. No, he said, because if I had to demand to be treated with dignity, then the system is already broken. Every person, regardless of title, race, or status, deserves to be treated with respect. That's not something you should have to earn. It's something you should be given. Always. The interview went viral. People shared it, discussed it, debated it, and slowly, conversations began to change. Today, if you walk into Courtroom 5A, you'll see something new hanging on the wall. It's a framed photo. Judge Elijah Thorne, in his robes, behind the bench. But if you look closely, you can still see the faint marks on his wrists in that photograph. The scars of that September morning. They didn't edit them out. Because those scars tell a story. A story about power misused. About dignity denied. And about justice, finally served. Beneath the photo, a small plaque reads, Equal justice under law, not because of who you are, but because of who you are entitled to be, human. And every day, officers, attorneys, defendants, and citizens walk past that photo. And they remember that justice isn't just blind. It's supposed to be fair. So what happened to the officers who arrested Judge Thorne? Briggs now works in private security. Shaw left law enforcement entirely. Neither has spoken publicly about that day. But the story? The story lives on. Because it's not just about one man. It's about a system. It's about every person who's ever been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. It's about the gap between the ideal of justice and the reality so many face. Judge Elijah Thorne didn't just walk into that courtroom with torn clothes and bloodied knees. He walked in carrying the weight of every unjust arrest, every cruel laugh, every ignored plea of innocence. And he turned that weight into change. That's the power of a reversed moment. When humiliation meets dignity. When cruelty meets consequence. When a man who was mocked becomes the man who delivers the verdict. The officers laughed that morning. But in the end, justice had the last word. And it was delivered by the very man they tried to break. The words carved above that courtroom door? Equal justice under law. On that September morning, those words were tested. And Judge Elijah Thorne made sure they held, not just for himself, but for everyone who comes after.